You know, folks, every day I get accused of being hyperbolic, and someone will say, "Oh, Brando, you're just blowing all this out of proportion now. You're just creating a bunch of hysteria. That ain't going to happen. I don't think Trump would actually do that. I think you're taking it out of context." Or my favorite one is whenever they say, "Oh, well, that's not what I voted for. I didn't vote for him to do that." And I always say to myself, well, then I listened to him more than you did because we heard what he was going to say. We were trying to warn people about what he was saying, but everybody was too busy calling us hyperbolic. And here on the channel, many times I've said whenever Trump says, "Make America great again," he's talking about taking us back to a time when black people couldn't vote, when women stayed in the kitchen, when gay and trans people stayed in the closet, when black people drank out of different water fountains and sat in the back of the bus. And people say, "Oh, no, Brando, that ain't true. He'd never do nothing like that. You're just blowing this all out of proportion. He would never do that." Well, here he is doing that. So tell me how I'm blowing this one out of proportion. This headline, again, is real, and it's in 2025, and they're trying to take us back to a time before 1965, and they're trying their damnedest. So we're going to read this article here from NPR, and this story is still developing, but man, I never thought, actually, I did honestly think that, yeah, you know what? One day we will be reading that in 2025. So here we go. Segregated facilities are no longer explicitly banned in federal contracts. And this was posted on NPR. After a recent change by the Trump administration, the federal government no longer explicitly prohibits contractors from having segregated restaurants, waiting rooms, and drinking fountains. The segregation clause is one of several identified in a public memo issued by the General Services Administration last month, affecting all civil federal agencies. The memo explains that it is making changes prompted by President Trump's executive order on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which repealed an executive order signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965 regarding federal contractors and non-discrimination. The memo also addresses Trump's executive order on gender identity. While there are still state and federal laws that outlaw segregation and discrimination that companies need to comply with, legal experts say this change to contracts across the federal government is significant. Melissa Murray says this. She says, "It is symbolic, but it's incredibly meaningful in its symbolism. These provisions that required federal contractors to adhere to and comply with federal civil rights laws and to maintain integrated rather than segregated workplaces were all part of the federal government's efforts to facilitate the settlement that led to the integration of the 1950s and 60s. The fact that they are now excluding those provisions from requirements for federal contractors, I think, speaks volume," Murray said. Deleted mentions of drinking fountains, transportation, and housing. The clause in question is in the Federal Acquisition Regulation known as FAR, a huge document used by agencies to write contracts for anyone providing goods or services. So one clause of FAR is titled Prohibition of Segregated Facilities and reads, "The contractor agrees that it does not and will not maintain or provide for its employees any segregated facilities at any of its establishments, and that it does not and will not permit its employees to perform their services at any location under its control where segregated facilities are maintained." That clause has been in government contracts for decades, at least as far back as President Reagan, according to this digitized 1983 issue of the Federal Register. The current version of the clause, last updated in 2015, defines segregated facilities as work areas, restaurants, drinking fountains, transportation, housing, and more. And it says you can't segregate based on race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or national origin. Several federal agencies, including the Departments of Defense, Commerce, and Homeland Security, have notified staff who oversee federal contracts that they should start instituting these changes. And a recent notice from the National Institutes of Health shows that the change is already in effect. The notice regarding a maintenance agreement for the scientific freeze dryer cites the GSA memo reads, "The prohibition of segregated facilities and FAR equal opportunity will not be considered when making award decisions or enforce requirements." To be clear, all businesses that have government contracts and those that do not still need to follow the federal and state laws, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which does make segregated facilities illegal. in effect immediately. One federal worker who works on contracts says they were shocked when they received the notice from the FAR changes from their agency. NPR has agreed to not identify the worker because they feared being fired for speaking to media without authorization. They said the process used to institute these changes without a typical public notice or comment period of 30 to 60 days is usually reserved for urgent matters or national emergencies. The FAR's rules explain that this public comment period is required for significant revision. The way that they are implementing this in the contracting field is essentially subverting democracy. You're supposed to allow agencies to comment on this, contracting officers to comment on it, and think through the implications, the worker said. By doing this, they're essentially ramming things through and hoping that no one is going to notice. And in a statement, the General Services Administration spokesman Will Powell wrote, the GSA has taken immediate action to fully implement all current executive orders and is committed to taking action to implement any new executive orders. Now, after this story was published, Powell sent NPR an additional statement defending the process the GSA used to implement changes without public comment, used as a common practice and permissible, not only used for emergency circumstances. And then dropping right down here, Kara, I can't pronounce her last name, an attorney at the Wiley Law Firm in Washington, D.C., which specializes in federal contracts, speculates that the provision was flagged because it was revised under the Obama administration to include gender identity. That change was made, she says, to implement an Obama-era executive order, and that executive order from the Obama administration is one of the ones that President Trump in his second term has rescinded, she explains. And so, along with Trump's other executive orders about gender identification, I would suspect that this is the reason why